afternoon, everybody. It's Mike Murphy with FixUS. Thanks for joining again for another one of our FixUS Conversation events. Today, I'm really happy to be joined by Matt Moen, who's president of the Gettysburg Foundation. And Matt will talk to you a little bit about that in a second on some background of the Gettysburg Foundation. And so we're hosting this conversation today in, frankly, in recognition of the anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg earlier in July. But also now, aside from that anniversary, you know, it certainly begs the question of why and how is FixUS related to the work of the Gettysburg Foundation. And so the quick story is I got connected with Matt, I don't know, Matt was probably about well over a year ago now, after hearing about an initiative that he was doing at the Gettysburg Foundation called Gettysburg Revisited. And essentially, which I'll talk to you about in a second, was using the Battle of Gettysburg as a jumping off point for a educational program and a roadshow to talk to people about the need for civility in our political discourse. And certainly that's of interest to, to folks that are following and supporting FixUS. So I thought, given that connection and the anniversary this month, it'd be a great topic to have Matt come on and talk with us about for one of our FixUS conversations. So we're going to jump into it in a second here. For those that are new to this, just to quickly give a couple of housekeeping items. We try to keep these conversations short. We won't keep you for more than about a half hour. Matt and I will go back and forth in dialogue, but we want to bring you into the dialogue. So for folks that are on, please use the Q&A feature on the Zoom at the bottom of the screen. Use it, please use it liberally at any time. Type in questions. I'm going to try and work them in here to the conversation throughout. You can start typing questions as soon as we begin here, and then we'll work them in. So please use that Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom. The other housekeeping item is we are recording this session so we can share it broadly and nationally around the country with those that haven't been able to join us live. So with that, Matt, thanks for coming on and joining us. Let's jump in here. Just Matt, start off by, can you give folks just a background on yourself, Gettysburg Foundation, its purpose and mission, and then we'll talk more about the specific initiative.
Sure, happy to do that, Mike. It's nice to be with you. Thanks to you and your colleagues for the work that you do. I'm Matthew Moen. I'm president of the Gettysburg Foundation. The Gettysburg Foundation is a educational philanthropic 501c3 organization that works in a public-private partnership to preserve Gettysburg National Military Park and the Eisenhower National Historic Site, and to educate the public about their significance.
Talk a little, give the primer on the battle here a little bit, because for the non-Civil War buffs, give some of the big picture overview of the battle that you used to then talk about for your program.
Sure, the historians are going to kill me. I'm a political scientist by training, and I'm going to cover the history of the Gettysburg battle in about 15 seconds, which is
right.
The Confederates are marching north. They go to Gettysburg because all roads lead to Gettysburg, about 10 different roads. General Lee tries to consolidate his Confederate army in that little hamlet. That's where he encounters the Union Army. They fight for 3 days, 160,000 men, about 51,000 casualties, most famously resulting in Pickett's charge on day 3 to try to break the center of the Union line unsuccessfully, and the Confederate invasion of Pennsylvania is ended, and they head back to Virginia.
Okay, now that was the quickest Gettysburg battle that anyone's had to give, but we thought it was necessary for the non-Civil War buffs. Little set the table. Talk about Gettysburg Revisited. So can you just give the inspiration there, Matt, because you started it while you were president. I mean, why'd you do it? Give the overview, its purpose, what you've been doing on that, and we'll use that to jump off into other questions.
Sure. So Gettysburg Revisited was my public education initiative to take the post-battle healing and conciliation that occurred in Gettysburg and take it out to the American people across the country to talk about how conciliation can follow even the most bitter conflict. And so the way I often framed it was to remind people that for 3 days, Gettysburg in 1863 was a place of incredible violence, the largest battle in the history of North America. But for the last 157 years, Gettysburg has not been a place of conflict. It's been a place of healing, of presidents coming to say conciliatory words, of veterans meeting up, of tending the wounded after the battle, of President Lincoln famously coming to Gettysburg. And so there are a lot of powerful lessons about how we can, as Americans, patch things up in the most dire of consequences. And, you know, Mike, that's just a message that we all need to keep at the top of our minds. And bless you and your colleagues at FixUS for doing it. And we were doing it at Gettysburg. And like you said, that's exactly how we got linked up. And we even did a program together, you and I, talking about this very thing. So I'll turn it back.
It was a combination of road shows, because at the time we were doing our own road show, trying to bring attention to the polarization of our country too. And we thought it was a natural fit. Talk a little, Matt, expand upon the lessons. I mean, what are some of the lessons you dig in on when you're out there talking about this with folks?
Sure. Well, I often framed it in the context of Lincoln. Lincoln famously wrote, not at Gettysburg, but as part of his message to Congress when he sent the Emancipation Proclamation, that we could either nobly save or meanly lose this great American democratic experiment. And I would go out to service clubs, historical societies, I would go to colleges and universities. I logged about 28,000 miles, about 40 venues is what I did personally. And I would go out and I would remind people of that admonition from Lincoln. And then I would remind people that at Gettysburg, Lincoln spoke profoundly about the preservation of the American democratic experiment. When you think about the beginning of the Gettysburg Address, it starts out 77 years ago, which is just a math problem. That's 87 years minus 1863 when he delivered the address, which dates the founding of the country to the spirit of liberty and equality found in the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And he more famously ends that governments of, by, and for the people shouldn't perish from the earth, because if they did, Mike, then all of that death was in vain. That's Lincoln's message in Gettysburg. And so I would go out and simply talk to people about the fact that there was this extraordinary battle. There was this extraordinary healing process that has continued for decades and decades and decades, all toward the preservation of this unique American democratic experiment, which is the longest running and most successful experiment in the history of the world. And so, you know, it's almost kind of in the gentle reminder category.
Well, I was going to build off of that, and then just remind folks, please type in, feel free, we got a couple coming in, and I'm going to go to them in a second.
Sure.
Questions, use the Q&A feature, please. But build off of that and sort of the resonance today. Look, I mean, I see, there's been lots of polls on this. I know there was one a couple of years ago. I've cited, I think it was, I think it was like a third of Americans think we're going to be in another civil war within the next 5 years, right, based on our political discourse. Now, I'm not one of those in the third, but I think the fact that a third of people are feeling that is obviously telling. I mean, so what is when you're trying to do this out around, you're obviously trying to tie it to the current environment. How does it resonate? What are your people's reactions, given that we're talking about in a climate of such divisiveness today?
Well, I'm with you, Mike, and I think all Americans of good spirit go around that point that, yeah, we're having some turbulent times, but we can fix them. We've been through many turbulent times in this regime before. We've as Americans fought a revolution for independence. We've endured a Great Depression. We've endured 2 world wars of scope. We somehow managed to get past the slavery crisis in our country. And so we've had a lot of significant problems that we can fix. And people of goodwill simply need to go out there and fix them in the very kind of spirit that you guys proffer for the country. And so that's why I find your work remarkable. I tried to be complimentary to it by going out and saying, look, here on the sacred soil of Gettysburg, we have this enormous conflict in human history. But after that, it's a place that is completely different. And I'll just give you one example of not even a person. But when I would drive around the battlefield, I would often see veterans, maybe sitting by themselves, lost deeply in thought, engaged in a spirit of healing. And that's the kind of powerful message that Gettysburg can bring if people are simply reminded of it.
I'm on mute. We'll use that to jump off into question. People are following my ask here of typing them in. So we got a bunch. So I'm just going to start going through, Matt, and see how many we can get through here. All right, this one I think is a timely one, right? So Dana asks, the post-battle conciliation wasn't racially neutral. That enabled the lost cause narrative and Jim Crow. How do you deal with that?
Well, that's true, and it's equally true what I also said earlier, right? It's like the Battle of Gettysburg did not solve the problem. Reconstruction was awful, right? So there's not a naivete to it that the Battle of Gettysburg somehow solved America's racial problems. I simply point out that within the borough of Gettysburg, where there were about 11 injured or dead soldiers for every man, woman, and child in Gettysburg, that in that borough, after that battle, was an incredible amount of empathy and of healing and of kindness shown to soldiers of both sides. That doesn't mean everybody, and it doesn't mean all of America's problems are solved. It simply means that that kind of conciliation has a place and can follow that bitter conflict.
Question from Nancy. After the war, both Union and Confederate veterans of the battle came back to Gettysburg. Can you talk about why these soldiers continue to return to this place of great carnage and what we can learn from that? Kind of spoke to this a little bit already, but build on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the really interesting developments after the battle. There's these remarkable stories. There's Elizabeth Thorne, a woman who is 6 months pregnant, who helps with her father to bury 100 Union soldiers after the battle. There's Lydia Hamilton Smith, who takes a wagon. She's half African-American and half Irish. And she takes a wagon and she goes out every which way direction in Pennsylvania daily on that wagon. And she tells people, you're not going to believe what happened at Gettysburg. Can you spare anything? Food, anything. And does this on her own. There's this incredible tent hospital set up called Camp Letterman, about a mile from the square, where both Union and Confederate soldiers are treated. And there's some incredible letters from Confederate soldiers who write and say, you know, I'm captured now. I'm sitting out the rest of this war, but they've been taking just as good a care of me as they have those boys in blue. And in that same spirit, you'll find these other kinds of healing examples, including the veterans who will return on the 50th anniversary in large numbers. It doesn't mean everything was rosy. Some of the pictures that show them shaking hands were undoubtedly staged, but they were in good enough frame of mind to actually just smile and shake hands over the wall of Pickett's charge, right? And so thousands and thousands of these men come back, both to process it as veterans might and have often who have endured war, and also because Americans did a remarkable thing. And this is what I like to remind our audiences, is that Americans did the remarkable thing of having a civil war and patching it up enough to continue the democratic experiment. And there's an awful lot of places around the world that were not able to do that. And so, you know, then on the 75th, FDR comes, he dedicates the Peace Light, the Eternal Peace Light Memorial, which is part of the monumentation, part of the landscape at Gettysburg. It's a beautiful place to stop with a beautiful overlook of the first day of the battle. And it's a reminder of conflict giving way to peace.
I'm going to keep going through a bunch of questions here. I'm going to keep going through as many as we can. TJ Lindbergh's one of our chapter leaders for FixUS out in Arizona. Matt, he says, who or which organizations helped drive the reconciliation process? What was their motivation for doing so? Any thoughts, reactions on that?
Well, these are all really good questions, and I'm able to answer some better than others. That one I'm not able to answer as well. I know more what happened in the borough of Gettysburg because I lived there the last several years. I don't know as much nationally who drove them. A lot of them were that did the healing afterwards, included Catholic nuns, included Quaker nurses, included a variety of Christian-related organizations that rushed in. Nurses and doctors rushed in to Gettysburg to triage the carnage that happened. And so I suspect that you have groups like that, probably some of the early forerunners of organizations that we recognize today. You know, Clara Barton was at Gettysburg.
Right.
And so sort of a monumental effort for a monumental problem, right? And a lot of great work done by a lot of great people that goes unappreciated in the sense that we tend to focus on the battle and what happened during the 3 days of conflict.
Right. We'll go on next question from Doug. Doug Palmer says, Matthew, appreciate your quick summary of trying the situation Gettysburg to today. But doesn't the fact that there was a winner and a loser back then, although a gracious winner, differ from today's environment currently where there is no winner or loser? We aren't at the Gettysburg finality yet. That's an interesting question. I'm not sure in terms of parallels to today. Have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that that's a great question too. And I think it speaks to the fact that in American national electoral politics, as part of our culture of democratic norms, we have to be both gracious winners and gracious losers. And that's part of how democracy functions. And we don't always get our way. Nobody gets exactly what they want most of the time. It's not surprising that conflict ensues in a nation as vast and as powerful and as complicated as ours. And part of what we need to do, and part of, again, what you all do with FixUS, and I thank you as an American citizen, is your efforts to remind people of those democratic norms, because without those kind of norms in play, which include the graciousness that your questioner referenced, democracy is not going to function well.
I'm going to combine three questions into one because they're all related to the moment we're living in right now in a different way in terms of the racial tensions. So one person's asking an anonymous question, but what healing lessons from Gettysburg can be applied to the racial unrest happening in the country today? Another one from Michael Maxeni, who's an old friend of mine. I'm glad to see him on. How can we accelerate the process of healing to live up to our promises to the freed slave? Okay. and then Jason Hawk, but it's related. I'm putting them together because of the moment that we're in of all these different topics. With some Americans digging away at the reconciliation since the Civil War by rebranding our forgiven Confederate veterans as traitors, we undoing the ideas learned at Gettysburg since the battle ended. So, I mean, I'm combining a lot of stuff there, Matt, obviously, but I mean, sort of the combination of given the racial unrest in the country and what healing lessons from Gettysburg can be applied there, but also obviously the context about the monuments being taken down. What reactions do you have to these big topics that require their own sessions to kind of dig into?
Well, at some point, Gettysburg may morph more into a symbol of our division. There are elements of that have happened the last 3 years. Most people differentiate between monuments for either Union or Confederate veterans. There's about 1,400 at Gettysburg. 1,300 of them are Union and 100 of them are Confederate, more or less. Most people differentiate between their presence on a battlefield in a national park versus monuments that may be put in a public square 150 years later. Not everybody does. And that's why I say Gettysburg increasingly becomes kind of a symbol, I think, of maybe conflict and of the reconciliation and peace that I think it can be. To go to the questions, I mean, none of us have an easy solution to the questions that are posed, which are all good observations. All I can say, drawing upon Gettysburg, is that we try to get that element which we so admired in Abraham Lincoln, which is to speak with clarity, which is to speak of goodness, which is to speak of purpose, and to do so with a great sense of humility. I wrote a companion blog that you can find on the Gettysburg Foundation website. I did it about 1.5 years. And one of the ones that I wrote that got the most play was talking about the various ways in which Lincoln exuded humility in his remarks at Gettysburg. And just a little bit of that humility for all of us, I think, would help in our currently troubled times. To remember that we may just be wrong, and we need to think about that.
Well said. I think this is an interesting question. So, anonymous person submitted, but a lot of cities have had domestic strife this summer. Okay, Portland, Minnesota, obviously relates to the last question on racial unrest. But he says, what can these cities learn from Gettysburg, the borough, as they strive to recover? So you've talked a little bit about this, but it's kind of like more localizing that reconciliation a little bit. Are there lessons learned from that, Matt, that you haven't spoken to yet?
I don't know. I think that's a fair question, and that's a perfectly relevant question. The time being so different, it's hard for me to draw the parallels other than, one of the beautiful things that happened at Gettysburg was how people rushed out and took care of people from both sides, and without regard to uniform. We own, in addition to owning and operating the Museum and Visitor Center at Gettysburg, we own and operate the Spangler Farm and Field Hospital, which was a field hospital after the battle, where soldiers from both armies were treated, and wrote interesting letters about that treatment, saying that they were treated well as the other guys. And so, it's just kind of those gentle reminders in these turbulent times. It's easy for us to get caught up in the news of the day, the excitement of the day, the poison of the day, whatever that may be, to remember that the great American experiment is a work in progress. Citizens of goodwill must come to it all the time, must come to it with some resolve, must come to it with humility, must come to it with a real sense of preserving that which has worked for so long, ranging from constitutionalism to informal democratic norms.
We have a couple minutes left. I'll the liberty of offering a question myself now. Sure. Going beyond a little bit the Gettysburg experience here for a second, Matt, because you and I have talked about this stuff before. I mean, putting on your political science political scientist hat here. I mean, beyond the sort of need to restore some fundamental democratic norms and broader civility in our political discourse, there's a lot of things that obviously we need to focus on there. Do you have other views, though, on some solutions? I mean, do you have some views on some institutional fixes? I mean, there are many different ideas that are out there in terms of reforms that could change the incentives to allow people to be more prone to compromise. As a political scientist, I just got to get your opinion on what do you make of the potential different ideas, reforms that should be part of a conversation?
I think there's a whole bunch of them out there, and I think a whole bunch of them are great. What we have a difficult time doing is building momentum for any of them. Before I went to Gettysburg, I was Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Dakota, where I grew up, and I went on a statewide civility tour. And I went to different communities funded by a grant. I was on the radio. I talked about particularly the Congress, and I talked about things that are legislative, and I talked about things that are informal, right? A couple of quick examples. Social science research shows that people do better when they're issued a moral reminder. Well, an obvious, simple moral reminder for the Congress would be to change the oath of office to emphasize more congeniality, or collegiality is a better word, as they do their duties, right? They should get rid of the 1-minute speeches. That's been talked about by political scientists for a long time, because 90% of the 1-minute speeches are partisan. They're not purposeful like their original intent was. You can go to campaign finance reform to change the incentive structure. You can go to ranked choice elections to see whether or not that works. There are complications, but then the people are incentivized to be everybody's at least second choice, if not their first choice. We've got to get at the problem of gerrymandering, which we've known about for 30 or 40 years. Both parties have played that game in different states. It's crying out for a solution. All of those are aimed at Congress. All of those, I think, would help. You're exactly right, Mike. You've got to change the incentive structure in some cases, and you've got to change the norms of conduct informally in other cases. What we need to do as citizens, you, me, the folks who joined us today, thank you for joining us. We need to be strategic and determined in our effort to bring about some of those reforms, changing the way that people interrelate, rather than simply waiting for people to get better manners, because that's not easily happening at the moment.
Well, we'll wrap up on that kind of inspiring call to action there. But I will conclude by saying, in the minute we have here, and let you kind of close here, Matt. I don't think I mentioned at the beginning, or you mentioned, but you'll be leaving as president officially here as Gettysburg Foundation, effective at the beginning of next month, right? And so, I was curious, any broader reflections on your time there, but also what's next? Anything you can share about what's next here for you?
Yeah, I decided after 3.5 years to be done. And so I'm done now at the end of this month, just a few more days. I've enjoyed my time at Gettysburg. I've worked with a lovely bunch of people. I learned a lot. And I got to meet people like you, Mike, at Gettysburg and elsewhere, right? And so it's been great fun. What I would like to do next, I'm working on my 8th book. So that's my short-term thing. I'm going to practice retirement and see what that's like. And then I think before too long, I would like to enjoin the national conversation in some different way toward these same goals of which we have spoken, that your group and you are committed to, that I will do, not with Gettysburg as a backdrop anymore, other than at the margins, but that I will do in my capacity as a PhD political scientist interested in American national politics, and who deeply loves this country and wants my generation to do a better job of handing it over to our children than we are currently doing. So I'm in for the long haul. I'm just retooling and regrouping, and I'll be back out there with all of you, I promise.
Good. We'll be keeping in contact about that. Thanks, Matt. Really appreciate you joining today. Thanks, everybody from around the country joining on. Encourage folks, check out a lot of what Matt talked about. You can go to the Gettysburg Foundation website. There's a section on the site. Google Gettysburg Revisited. On their website, you can find out a lot about what they've done there. Yes, we look forward to keeping in touch with Matt and wish him well. But thank you, everybody, for joining. And with that, wish you all a good afternoon. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you. Yep, thank you.